All right. Okay. So we were in the middle of this Imrei Yaakov. Did we finish it yesterday? Oh, we were in the middle of the Biurim, I think. We were talking about the waiter who slips and falls. So he quoted the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Ayin Ches. The Mechaber writes, "The imnitkal kishuhu mahalech v'nafal ala kli v'shibero chayav nezek shalem." If a person slips and falls, and in the course of falling, he damages someone else's property, he has to pay full damages. Umavur mizeh denitkal eno onus gamur. What we see from here is that a person who trips is not considered an onus, a person who cannot be held blameworthy at all because it's just something completely unavoidable. He says, and therefore we should hold him liable, the waiter, if he trips. But there's another place in Shulchan Aruch which states as follows: that if a person was carrying a jug, he trips, the jug breaks, and the jug, in the course of its falling and breaking, damages other people, patur, the person is going to be exempt. Because why? The Shulchan Aruch says because a person who trips is not acting negligently, and therefore he should not be held liable. This seems almost to be a contradiction in the language. On the one hand, we're saying he's not an anus, he's not considered to be someone that is completely doing something that's unavoidable, and therefore he's liable. But on the other hand, if he trips and other people are damaged by the object that he's carrying, so then he is not liable. So we see that if you damage because you trip, you're going to be patur. This seems to be a stira, a contradiction. So the Aruch HaShulchan is sensitive to this inherent contradiction, and he writes as follows. Okay. He says, "V'tzarich lomar, the Rabbeinu Habeit Yosef Svirle, denitkal lo havi anus gamor." You have to say that on the one hand, it's not completely an accident that was unavoidable. And that's why when a person trips and in the course of his falling, he breaks an object and by falling on it, then he's going to be chayav. But if he damages another human being at the time when he trips, he's going to be exempt. Because we can argue that the person who is the injured party should have watched himself also. There's a certain small percentage of liability that is placed upon the person who has the object fall on him and injure him, that person also, if he sees a guy tripping, he might have a split second to move out of the way, to dodge or whatever it is. And that's why it says in the other place in Shulchan Aruch that if he injures other people, so when you're dealing with an inanimate object, or you're dealing with a dumb animal who is damaged by someone else's tripping, so then you can't say that they should have gotten out of the way, because they didn't have the wherewithal to get out of the way. But if a human being is damaged by a person who trips, the argument is that the human being may have done something to mitigate that damage by either moving out of the way or falling properly or whatever it is. So that's the distinction that the Aruch HaShulchan draws to explain the inherent stira, the inherent contradiction between the two places in Shulchan Aruch. However, omnam la'anius daiti. So Reb Stern says, however, I would like to offer a different approach. Hayanira lichora diyesh lechalek bein im hizik al yedei gufo v'kocho ubein im hahizik nasa al yedei excuse me al yedei kli shenafal miyado. He says the distinction that I believe we should draw is as follows. There's a difference between a person who damages through his own direct force, through his body, or through his inertia, versus whether he damages via a utensil that falls from him. That's also a distinction between the two. What do I mean? So he says, "V'hainu debesimin shenayim ches dekaimalon sham dechayav ma'iri shuguf ha'adam asa et hahezek." He says, in the first case that we discussed, where a person trips and falls on someone or something, on a kli and breaks it, that's talking about where the body of the person who's tripping causes the damage. And therefore, even though he tripped, but since he might have fallen in a slightly different way, could have been aware of how he was falling and maybe mitigated his falling to some degree or another, we therefore hold him liable. Masha'in came b'simin tuf yud beis, ma'iri shal yedei shenitkal nafal miyado hakli v'hizik et chavero. But in simin tuf yud beis, the person trips, and as a result of his tripping, he drops a kli. A kli falls from his hands, and the kli injures somebody else. He's holding a glass item, and he trips. The glass item falls from his hands and hits somebody in the head or hits someone in the foot, whatever it is. It lands on somebody's foot, let's say. He says, "Debazeh yesh liftor." He says, in that situation, we should declare the person to be patur. Uchein svar zu ra'isi b'machanei Ephraim Hilchot Shomrim Siman Lamed Tes Divrei Masul Ivra. And he says, my cue or sort of support for making this distinction as to whether it's the person himself who falls, or whether it's, and causes the damage, or whether it's the object that falls from his hand that causes the damage, is that the Sefer Machanei Ephraim writes as follows. He says, "Nira desvirle laharambam the adam hamazik lo havi ela b'mazik begufo." That it would seem that when a person causes damage and he's held fully liable, that's when the damage is caused by his very person, his own body. Kagon shenafal al hakli v'nishbar o bekocho, when he falls on an object, right? Aval hecha denafal hakli miyado v'nishbar. Adam hamazik, but when an object falls from his hands, that's not called a human being who's causing damage. And therefore, there are times when we can suggest that such a person will not be held liable. V'chein ra'iti achar kach b'pischei Choshen azikin perak aleph os chaf daled ayin sham b'shem Imrei v'harayvid, and he quotes a number of different sources. He says, Ulam, I'm just skipping a couple of lines. Gam chiluk hanal eino muchrach. He says, but at the same time that I think that this distinction works, so let's just review. We have the distinction of the Aruch HaShulchan, who says that the difference is the nature of the damagee. If the damagee is an animal or a utensil, you can't expect them to dodge the slip, to dodge the fall, and therefore you're going to be liable. But if the damagee is a human being, The human being has to be aware of his surroundings and therefore has to assume some of the responsibility of the damage that is caused by the slipper. Okay? So that's the distinction of the Aruch HaShulchan. The distinction of Rav Stern in the Biurim is that there's another distinction. Is the person causing the damage with his own body or the inertia of falling, or is it because something falls from his hands and that object causes the damage? And that's the difference. If you're damaging with your own body, then you're liable. If you're damaging indirectly because something falls from your hands and then lands on somebody's foot or spills on somebody's clothing, so then you're not going to be held liable. And then he says, even though I've created this distinction and I have support for it, nonetheless, I have to submit that it is not necessarily the case. The Yesh Lomar, because we could always argue, the Hadasim in Shinayin Chesif Aleph Marishanit Kal Bekad Atzmo B'Shibaro. He says that a person in Siman Shin Ayin Ches could have slipped on the jug and broken the jug. The Hakad Hayamunach b'Makom sheyesh lo reshut lahanicho kegon lifnei Beit Abad. And the person who left the jug there had permission to leave it there, and so the person who damages it is going to be is going to be held liable. V'hainu hadin shemuva gam b'simin taf yud beis sif beis v'chein mashma mehagra. Masha'in kein had b'simin taf yud beis sif dalet de patur ma'iri shenit kal bekarka v'nafal v'hizik. And perhaps the distinction is this, that in the case that you're chayav, it's because you tripped over something that you should have been looking out for because it was right there and it was something that was expected to be there and you slipped on it and you didn't notice it, and therefore you're going to be liable. Whereas in Siman Taf Yud Beis, where you're putter, you slipped on or tripped on the pavement or the ground, you fall and you damage. There you're not negligent. He says, and that's a third distinction that we could make. The third distinction is, what were the circumstances as to why you tripped? Did you trip because you should have looked where you were going? Or did you trip because there was something completely unexpected that you encountered on the road? And so, that's right. By the olive press, where you should have known that there were jugs there, and you had no right to not look where you were going. And therefore, if you end up breaking one of the jugs that are by the olive press, you're going to be liable. Whereas if you end up tripping and falling and damaging someone on the road, the reason you're going to be putter is because there was nothing that you should have anticipated on the road. Okay, he says, "Ulafi chiluk zeh gam im nitkal v'nafal v'hizik begufo patur." And using that line of argumentation, then even if you end up damaging with your own body, but you tripped not because you should have looked where you were going, but rather just stam, then you would also be putter. Because according to this argument, there would be no difference between whether you damage with your body directly or whether you damage because an object falls from your hands. V'ayin b'milchamot reish per gimel, abechelik shematchil kasuv b'sefer hamaor, v'ayin od le'el simin seif aleph b'Imrei Yaakov, mashakasav b'shem harambam b'shar tzion sham. And so he basically refers us to other sources. So, bottom line, he doesn't answer the question. He says there are three possible distinctions that you could draw as to why in one place in Shulchan Aruch you're chayav when you trip, and why in another place in Shulchan Aruch when you trip you're going to be pater. It's very complicated. Now, if we hold up these three distinctions to the analysis of the waiter who trips, then we have to think to ourselves as follows. Well, what was the first distinction that was drawn? That was the distinction of the Aruch HaShulchan. And what did he say? He said, It depends who's being damaged. Depends on the damagee, right? So in the case of the waiter who trips and spills the soup on the customer, so he's a human being. He's a damagee who's a human being and could have done something perhaps to mitigate the damage. If he hears the waiter coming and all of a sudden he sees the guy slipping, or maybe he should have been more aware of his environment, maybe he could have gotten out of the way quicker. Who knows? So that's one argument. And maybe according to the Aruch HaShulchan, if the waiter trips and falls, the waiter would not be held liable. Then we have the second distinction, which is that Rav Stern offers as a substitute, that it depends whether the damage is being caused by the body of the person who trips or whether it's being caused by the objects that fall from the tripper. And in that case, if you say that you're going to be exempt when it's the objects that fall from you and not your body itself, so then if the waiter trips and the soup falls off the tray and spills on the guy's garment, so then according to that argument, he'll be potter. Again,
because if you trip, you cannot control your body while you're holding. So if you're holding something like a jar or something, you trip, you can keep holding on it and go all the way to that.
It depends on the situation, not necessarily. Others would argue just the opposite, that if you can control your body more than you can control the objects that you're holding, or maybe let's say you're balancing on a tray. It's not as easy to, obviously it depends on the scenario, right? But that's another distinction that the Sefer Machane Ephraim was drawing. And then the third distinction, that it depends on how the guy tripped. Did the guy trip because he should have been watching where he was going, and he tripped over something that he should have been aware of was a potential problem? Or did he trip completely out of circumstances that there was no way for him to anticipate that? So let's say a person pulls a prank and sticks out his leg and the waiter trips. So there it becomes a little bit more obvious that the waiter should not have anticipated that, and the waiter should not be held liable at all. But let's say there are customers who, let's say the waiter trips over the back of a chair, over one of the legs of a chair, or he trips over a cable that he should have seen that was there because it was being set up for the audio-visual presentation at the front of the room, right? Or some other, in a banquet hall or something like that. So you'd have to submit it to all of these kinds of analysis. And in the final analysis, it's really quite unclear. You have to really go down to the very nitty-gritty of every single detail to find out to what degree the waiter was negligent or not. But these are three separate factors that would be weighed according to the halacha. Now, that's all according to, that's a halachic analysis. Now, of course, what should the restaurateur do when the waiter trips? All right, so if it happens only one time and the guy's a reliable waiter, you apologize to the customer, you offer to either pay for his meal or to get his clothing dry cleaned, and that's how you keep your customers happy, right? But that's just doing the business. But that's not, of course, how we would come out halacha. But let's see. It all depends on the circumstances. Okay.
We don't put any liability on the restaurant itself. In this case, it's only between the waiter and the people the patron. But there is no liability if they left a cable there or something is blocking the way, or it's just, let's say, oil on the floor in the restaurant.
Well, again, there might be liability on the restaurant if they negligently put obstacles in the path of the waiters and don't inform them. that would also certainly play a role, like if just like a guy who sticks out his foot to trip the waiter, you know. Could be that the restaurant would have to assume liability if the owner knows that there's an uneven floor somewhere, and he's too cheap to get it fixed, and he doesn't disclose it to the waiters or something like that, or that you're right. So there could be scenarios where the restaurateur is the one who's going to be liable.
They have a regular floor. Every time they open the door, the humidity comes in and it gets damp. It gets very slippery. So when it's dry, it's totally fine. But when they open the door, the humidity comes in and condensation gets into the floor, and everybody sleeps. The patrons, the waiters, everybody's sleeping in the restaurant. So that could be like a restaurant issue, no?
It sounds like it's a restaurant issue. If you know that you're gonna, by putting down a certain kind of floor, people are gonna slip, then you have a responsibility to mitigate that. There's you can put down strips, slip strips. There's all things that you can do to control slippage.
After they wash the floors, I put up that beacon to say caution wet floor.
Yeah.
So I think maybe to mitigate their potential liability.
Right. And supermarkets deal with slip and fall cases all the time.
If they don't put that sign, they're liable. If they have to put the sign, so now they have a way out, because now they're telling you they're slippery. So now you walk in there, you know that this.
Right. Correct. Right.
That kind of reinforces the position.
Yeah.
If you as a person participate.
You have to, right. If you walk on what Lloyd is raising is that if you walk in a place like the olive press, where you know that there are going to be things that you could trip over, you have to watch where you're going. Similarly, if someone puts up cones and says wet, caution, slippery and wet, then the liability would be on the individual who slips for not being careful. I'm just wondering, what would be the liability if a person goes out in the snow when it's very cold and icy, and slips and ends up injuring someone in the course of slipping, or injures a utensil? On the one hand, could you argue, well, you knew it was icy and slippery, so you have to assume liability for walking out. On the other hand, you could also say to the person who's carrying this very delicate object, but you also know that people typically slip and fall. What are you doing walking around with this delicate object around other people? Shouldn't you be, right? Guy's carrying a birthday cake out of his car and about to take it to his house, and then a guy walking down the street slips and falls and smashes into him. The whole cake goes kaput, right? So who's now liable for the birthday cake? So it's not clear. It's not clear. It's the same case as the waiter, and you'd have to weigh a bunch of different circumstances. Perhaps the guy walking, if he sees someone carrying something in his hands, should wait until the guy moves before he walks in front of him. It's really, really unclear in the halacha who has to, and it could be that because of the lack of clarity, maybe they should split the cost.
Property, because the owner of the property is moved there, or it's public property.
Right? And Mordechai says the distinction could also be if it's public property versus private property, where the slip takes place. Okay, number of different things to consider. Okay.
What if, Rabbi, may I ask a question?
Sure.
What if the waiter's paid versus not paid? In other words, you go to a restaurant or you come over to my house and I accidentally spill something on the guest.
Yeah, well, I don't think that makes a difference. You're not paying the waiter not to slip. You're paying the waiter for his labor, right? I mean, that shouldn't affect his level of liability, I don't think. I mean, there's also something that we have to also consider every time you walk into a public space like a restaurant, there's an assumed liability that you're assuming that because you're in a public space, things happen. Things happen. People spill things, people trip, and you have to know that there's always a chance that someone may spill something on you, or you may slip and fall. And but that's not enough. That assumption of liability because you're in a public space does not completely exempt the proprietor from keeping clean and non-slippery floors, and it doesn't fully exempt the waiter from doing his job diligently and watching out for hazards on the floor and making sure that he doesn't slip and fall. So if you want to have some fun with this, I'm sure there's probably a dozen or so videos on YouTube of waiters who are slipping and falling. I would imagine so. Yeah. All right. But anyway, so we'll hold it here for today, and Mirza Hashem will continue